Good afternoon and morning. Welcome to another webinar hosted by the America Chair on Technology, Innovation, and International Regulation. My name is Esther Zalin Adu, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we start, I would like to mention a few words about the Chair. The America Fund strives to be a platform that supports academic cooperation, exchanges, programs, and research to disseminate and strengthen comparative knowledge of European and American societies. One initiative that supports our mission is the America Chair on Technology, Innovation, and International Regulation, which aims to provide interdisciplinary research on expertise on regulatory developments in Europe and America with a focus on technology, innovation, and international regulation. Through these initiatives, we promote opportunities for cooperation amongst stakeholders across the Atlantic. In today's discussion, we are joined by Professor Kathleen Clausen, who is a professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. She also served as an arbitrator counsel and as of counsel to the Tribunal in International Trade and Investment cases. We have also Mr. Paul Swoboda, who's a senior visiting fellow at the European Policy Center, where he co-leads a project on European economic security. And last, but certainly not least, we have Mr. Joachim de Kok, who is a senior associate at the Competition and Regulation Department at the Amsterdam office of A&O Shearman. In today's discussion, we will focus on the emerging geostrategic environment that has prompted both sides of the Atlantic to incorporate economic security considerations into their respective trade and industrial policies. Of course, these policies have significant implications for the Transatlantic Alliance. So to help us understand this and prospects for cooperation, I would like to start the discussion by asking the panel, for our audience, in your view, how do you define economic security? We'll start with Kathleen, Joachim, and then Paul.
Thank you so much, Esther. It's a pleasure to be back for another one of these webinars and to see some friends in the audience joining us for our discussion today. Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this discussion with such distinguished colleagues. So, Esther, your question about defining economic security, I'm reluctant to go first because I fear my answer is that it doesn't matter. I'll be curious to hear what my colleagues think, but and maybe it's strange for a lawyer to say that, but I would submit to you that in this environment, in the present time, given the complexity of issues facing our economies on both sides of the Atlantic, it's more about what invoking economic security means than it is about defining its contours. Because in both domestic law in the United States, as well as in many areas of international law, invoking an economic security is all that matters. And in some instances, it's framed as national security, but in an economic frame. And in other circumstances, the words economic security may appear directly. But it's the fact that our governments are advancing these security premised arguments that we should be focused on. I'll be happy to say more about that. So again, I think the definition point, while important for us to understand what we're talking about, in practice, it's turned out we should be focused on the places and spaces where it's been called upon. Now, I'll just say one more thing and then I'll pass the floor. But I'll elaborate in our later conversation about where in the US this is coming up the most. But of course, the conversations about economic security are ubiquitous, right? I saw in the Financial Times the other day, columnist Alan Beatty was talking about economic security means having everyone on the same page, right? My good colleague at Fordham Law School, Harlan Cohen, talks about how economic security is advanced as a claim that we should focus on. And in my work with Tim Meyer, we talk about how economic security is advanced as a defense in different spaces. So this is all to say that most of us now, I think, are talking more about what it means for us rather than what it contains.
Many thanks, and we'll go to Joachim and then Paul.
I think I completely agree with Professor Clausen's comments just now, and thanks as well for allowing me to be here and the invitation. And let me try to maybe narrow it down in terms of like three elements in which we see that economic security is being advanced, right? So I think, and these tie into the European economic security strategy, which tries to provide a little bit of clarity on what economic security means in a European context. So there we see risks to critical infrastructures, which align more closely to traditional notions of security, where a state wants to prevent sabotage of its critical infrastructures, et cetera. It goes beyond that to also include the virtual space, cybersecurity risks, et cetera. But that's a relatively traditional security consideration or economic security consideration. Then you get into critical inputs, right? So you, on the one hand, you've like more traditional ones, like supply of energy, right? So to have the petroleum, but then it shifts as well towards solar panels, renewables, right? I mean, that also becomes then part of economic security. And the third one is about technology. And of course, technologies and critical inputs, they kind of tie in together, right? But for technologies, you see that it's not just about having, let's say, a stable supply chain of semiconductors, but it's also about being at the edge of innovation in the semiconductor sphere. And for a wide range of critical technology areas, such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, quantum, biotech, et cetera, the objective to have to be at the edge of innovation, or to have companies that are at the edge of innovation in your state, those are not just economic interests, but those become security interests, because it is viewed that being at the edge of innovation in these future technologies will give you a military supremacy in the long run. But it's not just about that, it's just also about being independent. So the strategic autonomy and avoiding independence, it's identified as a fourth concern or fourth objective in the European economic security strategy, but it really weaves into each of those three that I just mentioned. And maybe I'll hand over the floor to to Pavel to let him contribute or disagree.
Indeed, thank you, Joachim. Paul, you have the
Super.
floor.
Thank you so much for the floor. I would like to define economic security, at least for my own purposes, although I do agree with Kathleen and Joachim that mostly what we see in the public discourse is chasing individual problems, individual challenges, in a way which is not yet systematically defined. But I would define economic security as the pursuit of one's economic interests and socioeconomic development in the least constrained manner and with as much resilience as possible. I think this definition gives a gist of the essence of what is really the objective of economic security. Of course, this is still relatively fresh debate, right? We are emerging from 2.5 decades of globalization. We are coming out of a period in which economic security clearly had not been on top of policymakers' minds. So that's why the debate needs to stabilize, right? And I think it explains why in different corners of the public discourse, we have different priorities. In the European understanding of economic security, the word open is increasingly often mentioned. So this would mean open economic security. And this is an attempt to have the best of both possible worlds, right? To have the necessary degree of protection, which we need in today's world, but while pursuing open economic exchange. I mean, 80 countries around the world have the EU as the main trading partner. It would be insane for the EU to overnight throw all that away and decide to focus on a doctrine that is much more self-oriented. So in this concept of open economic security, we clearly have an attempt to combine openness with lack of naivete, because clearly what has characterized The approach in the past couple of decades especially is perhaps building excessive exposures in areas where caution should have predominated.
Many thanks. So we heard the themes of technology and innovation linked to military supremacy. Kathleen talked about the US context, and Paul touched upon the EU's unique openness when it comes to economic security. So as a follow-up, I want to ask the panel, what lessons can we draw from past manifestations of economic security from a foreign policy or trade law perspective? For instance, in the 1980s or 1990s or even earlier. We'll start with Paul, Joachim, and then Kathleen.
Well, my first point here would be that we are entering a qualitatively new period right now. So yes, there are lessons to be drawn from the past, but we also are seeing a paradigm shift, and this paradigm shift is there to stay for, I would say, somewhat longer. We don't know how long, but it is going to be there at least for the remaining part of this decade. So I'm saying this because what is happening today, and especially the past 2 to 3 decades, will be qualitatively different. Now we can always draw lessons from how we reacted to various crises in the past, be it the oil crisis in the 1970s. Or be it Japan's export performance in the 1980s. Yes, there were different types of reactions in the 1970s. Some countries took what was happening very seriously on the oil markets and decided to pursue focus on renewables in the case of Denmark, or nuclear energy in the case of France. Other countries have not done that, and today we can see that they are less resilient to energy shocks. So clearly, what is at the heart of our learnings is to envisage the unthinkable and develop resilience to crisis scenarios, which may not seem to be likely at a given point in time, but which are still entirely feasible. And reducing overexposures is the basic precondition of being successful in our approach to economic security in the future.
Many thanks. And Johan?
So for me, I'd like to maybe delve into another aspect, and that's the question of what does national security mean and who is affected by it. And I personally think it's fascinating that you see that CFIUS originated in the 1980s, 90s, with the rise of Japanese investments into the US. And one of the cases that triggered let's say, the maturity of CFIUS was an investment by Japanese Fujitsu into Fairchild Semiconductors in the US. And at the time, national security considerations were raised. Generally, at the time, a lot of national security considerations or national security concerns were raised with respect to Japan's performance in the economy. There being a lot of anxiety in the US about Japan taking over, Japan buying up Manhattan, the second Pearl Harbor. You get all this like warlike rhetoric as well in the 1980s. And if we look back, that kind of seems a little bit silly. And these security concerns were maybe a little bit overblown, especially when it comes to Japan. And they were also not very specified, right? And you see that security was used as this method of protectionism out of a concern that economically the US would no longer be ahead in certain industries. And you do see a similar discourse now with respect to Chinese investments, where there is a propensity to have very general, unspecified security considerations being then used to restrict trade or investments, right? And some are legitimate and some are maybe a little bit more on the protectionist side of things. If you look at, for instance, the US export import tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, those are justified on national security considerations, whereas they may have more to do with economic interest. So I think if we look back, we can recognize that some of these security considerations with respect to Japan maybe had more to do with economics and security. And I think that teaches us that the same might apply today, and just underscores the importance of being much more precise about what national security means. And to me personally, I think that it makes sense to maybe abandon this whole security, the narrow focus on security, and to recognize that economic interests are at play, and to say, okay, the previous age of open trade, open investments is over, and we're going to come up with a new paradigm that is not just based on security, but a wide range of economic interest. And the economic security exception tries to do that, but legally it's still security or national security. And I think we need to move away from that like national security paradigm into something that's a little bit more broader and recognizes that it's not just about security, but a wide variety of interest.
Thank you, Jochen. Kathleen?
Thanks, Esther. So let me take us down yet a third sort of road, because I think our prior speakers helpfully canvassed sort of the global picture and then bringing us down into specific policies. And I want to go even deeper down, if I may, to talk a little bit about how in the US particularly, and I'll leave the EU to the EU experts, but the lessons from the past, I think, have to do, the ones that I want to focus on have to do mostly with how our powers are structured to enable the US government, to enable whoever's in the White House to, again, back to my earlier theme, invoke economic security as a rationale, as a justification for taking certain actions. And some of those actions in the eyes of many violate international trade rules, and some of those actions may not. But again, it's looking more closely at the lessons that can be learned from the past in terms of the structures that are set up. So let me say what I mean by this. And first, let me submit to you a wonderful forthcoming article by Mona Paulson in the Yale Journal of International Law, which really digs in specifically on how U.S. trade policy never separated economics and security, and how they've always been intertwined as a policy matter. And indeed, that is the theme that I think is important to take away from what's come before and where we are now as well. In US law, what we see is two sets of structures, two sets of empowering structures for the executive branch. One set of delegations from Congress to the executive allows the executive to do more free trade, to do non-security things, to do non-protectionist things, right? That there's a line of delegations to the executive branch that came into effect back as from the early part of the 20th century all the way up to the present. Everyone is familiar with those. They're the authorities that allow the US president to enter into trade agreements, for example. Then the lesser studied until recently area was during the same period of time. That is, from the middle of the 20th century throughout the Cold War, we had these other seemingly exceptional powers, hard security ones and soft security ones, that allowed the president to exceptionalize, to actually add tariffs, right, where security so demanded. Okay, these are familiar to us now. I can throw out some numbers, though people will know Section 232, Section 301, the list goes on. And Joachim mentioned CFIUS as being another sort of area in which this is the case. So why do I raise all of this? Well, again, it's to say that these have been here for a very long time, right? The battlefields, so to speak, have not changed, right? The threats and the media through which they may have been manifested has changed over time in sort of our modern landscape. But the actual concerns, right? The concerns that motivated the entry of these particular statutory tools are longstanding. So what do we get from that? Well, if you look back at some of the motivations that drove these tools, you see that there is a widespread interest across the U.S. economy that's not going to be a surprise to anyone into how these tools are deployed, and that maybe the lesson here is that we should rethink the design of some of these tools. They They were used in the past. They're now being used again. And I think in both instances, a conversation arose as to let's change the design to make it more difficult or easy to use them. That's where we are again today. We're back talking about, in the case of the United States, should Congress have a stronger hand in what the executive branch is allowed to do? What other stakeholders should be at the table? Should we bring together our trading partners like the EU to redesign these tools? And so I think that's the common message, Esther, that goes throughout from the past when these tools were originally introduced to now today, to reevaluating them and saying, okay, how can we strengthen them? How can we re-envision them in ways that forms a sort of checks and balance that we are lacking now?
Thank you, Kathleen. So from our panelists' thoughts so far, Paul mentioned the open security, economic security aspect of the EU strategy. Also linked that to some of the past instances of economic security linked to energy crisis and so forth. Joachim touched upon the national security conceptualization around those times, especially around Japan. And then Kathleen kind of went through a deep analysis into how structurally some of this securitization of trade policy has always been an inherent feature in US law. So I want to put to the panel, in your opinion, what has prompted the current resurgence of economic security in trade policy discourse, especially from an EU and US perspective? We'll start from Joachim, then Kathleen, and then Paul.
So, I mean, it's an excellent question, and there's a variety of reasons, right? But I think in my perspective, there are three main themes. I think the first theme is Chinese investments. So after the global financial crisis, member states in Southern Europe had to privatize various critical infrastructures, including in the energy sphere, and the port of Piraeus, for instance, in Greece. And no one had money at the time except Chinese investors. So a lot of these critical infrastructures were sold to Chinese investors quite willingly, because they were able to bring in money to the economy that helped pay off some of the debt. Then you also see a rise of Chinese investments in the tech sphere around 2016. There's a really sharp increase of Chinese investments generally around this time in the EU. And the perception starts to shift from something that's very positive to something that maybe carries risks. And CFIUS also had a role in this, because CFIUS restricted at least two of those investments, whereas they could take place in the EU. Then you get COVID-19, right? And it just amplifies these concerns relating to Chinese investments. And you see dependencies start to become really clear, and like the negative aspects of those. So you see it in the area of face masks, for instance, where there is insufficient face masks and other protective equipment in the EU, and most of those products are being produced in China, and there's not enough available on the EU markets. You also see it in semiconductors, which are predominantly produced in Taiwan, but there's a semiconductor shortage. And then the third sort of catalyst is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Of course, Crimea had already been occupied, but the full-scale war of aggression by Russia in Ukraine just really triggered these concerns. Of course, it showed the undesirable dependencies on Russian gas, and it just amplified the whole discussion on economic security. So I think those are like three main themes that were critical to the development of this new notion in the EU.
Thank you, Joachim. And we'll head to Kathleen and then Paul.
Thanks. I will second pretty much everything that Joachim said. And I like to think about these in sort of two buckets. On the one side are the hard security issues. So hard security, I mean by that the actual physical tensions, right? The things that have bubbled up to now affect the trading system. And Russia-Ukraine is the obvious example there, although one can point to now surely several others. And then on and I raise that simply because not only Joachim talked about the sort of broader effect of that conflict, but I think that was for many the tipping point, at least within the WTO system, right? That raise people's attention to the legal implications of such hard security conflicts. The soft bucket is where more of the action, I think, is. And here I'm thinking of what Joachim said about China. While I was in the US government for a long time, the plan was to, and the attempt was to try to change China's practices through using, let's call them ordinary trade tools, those that were familiar, using WTO dispute settlement system, top of the list. And then there was, CFIUS all along, but that was, not so much China focused. So all these things are sort of happening through the systems that I think one would say in the trade and investment community were accepted global systems until patience ran out with those systems in achieving the goals that those in positions of authority had hoped and thought they could achieve. And so that then led to an exploration of other tools. And I remember the day sitting in the office of the US Trade Representative when we gathered around the table and said, okay, what other tools are there? And you hear this from Ambassador Tai as soon as she came into her role as US Trade Representative. Her number one thing in front of Congress when she would speak at a hearing was to say, we're going to need tools. We're going to need to think outside the box. And so that's where, as I mentioned earlier, US law allows the executive branch to say, oh, security brings me more tools. So invoking security allowed them to open up the toolkit and think more creatively about what was available to them and actions they might take. So dissatisfaction with the system is part of the invocation of economic security on the soft side. But I would also add other issues that may not be top of mind for us in our conversation today, things that we call sustainability issues, for example, right? No question, climate change, we talk about climate change, we could talk about other areas of social sustainability, those also prompting a security type response because of the existential threat, indeed, that some of them pose. So those two buckets, I think, are useful. The last thing I would say, Esther, then is with respect to what's the latest and greatest sort of use of these tools. And again, I'm back on my same theme about what they are allowing the US government to do. By that, I mean that now that there are lawsuits in the US courts challenging some of these actions, the ones that we've been talking about, for example, the tariffs on products from China, in those lawsuits in the US courts, now the US government is not just calling upon security in the sort of policy sense, right, to say this is important for our security, but also as a matter of legal argument. You see the executive branch coming in and saying that what we're doing in the trade space is not really just trade or even trade at all. What we're doing in these tariff actions is a security action. It's a foreign policy action. And when they're making those arguments, that is opening the aperture even further than we have experienced to date, trying to collect more space still for the executive branch. And that makes, I think, many people very nervous about what's ahead that we haven't yet seen, what's still yet to come in this space.
Thank you, Catherine. Val?
I would put the rise of global tensions as the number one reason for the current reconceptualization, because at the heart of it, we are witnessing the end of the doctrine of interdependence, which has been with us for several decades and which has postulated that countries which trade with each other, which have closer economic ties, also behave differently towards each other. Now, the benign view has slowly faded in the past few years, to the extent that the investments by different Chinese companies and Chinese government that Joachim mentioned earlier, which was very actively encouraged after the 2008 financial crisis, be it in the Greek port of Piraeus or be it in the Portuguese energy infrastructure. This now seems like a completely different era. So the rise of global tensions, I would put as number one. My number two most relevant factor is really the question of systemic nature, namely to what extent in the global trading environment we are dealing with economies that are compatible towards each other or not. And clearly the issue of Chinese overcapacity at the moment, most visible in areas such as solar panels with over 80% of global dominance. This points towards a systemic type of dimension that will be very difficult to come to terms with. Namely, it's not an issue that markets by themselves can solve. Because the root of the problem lies somewhere else. It lies in the nature of the Chinese economic system. So that would be my reason number two. Number three would be difficulties and problems in global governance. They have also contributed to where we are today. The fact that the WTO has gradually lost its ability to contribute in a meaningful way to resolving trade disputes. And there are obviously different reasons for it, not exclusively ones that have to do with China. This has clearly been a factor also contributing towards today's shift towards the doctrine of economic security. And the final reason has to do with the nature of today's shock-prone world with multiple disruptions that we have witnessed for, again, different reasons. The supply shocks during the COVID pandemic were completely unthinkable even a couple of years earlier. And yet we all realized that, that these types of disruptions are possible, that they are real, and that we have to prepare for them. So a multitude of reasons, but I would put global tensions first, closely followed by the growing realization both in Europe and in the United States of the systemic incompatibility of the Chinese model in particular and the Western economic model.
Thank you, Paul. And as we can see, especially from our audience, there's some common themes amongst the expertise provided by a panel, ranging from the kind of geostrategic competition between EU, US, and China, the frustrations that US officials eventually had with trying to encourage reforms in China, but that never happened. So there was a rethink on the kind of policy tools that they wanted to employ. And then, of course, you kind of touch upon the kind of overlapping crises that happened since the COVID-19 that some kind of coined out as a polycrisis that led to today's kind of policy kind of rethink and reconfiguration. So it begs the question, from a private sector perspective, what are the implications of these policy tools, especially in terms of competitiveness, the cost of regulatory compliance, and the potential impact on consumers? I'll start with Joachim because in his practice, he probably deals with these matters. And then we'll go to Kathleen and then Bao.
Thank you. So what I do in my practice is competition law and investment screening. And historically, it's been competition law, right? So when companies engage in a transaction, right, there's a purchaser, there's a target company. Historically, when the shareholder starts selling, right, you reach out to different parties, reach out to different purchasers, and the advisors would ask their lawyers like me, like, okay, what's the risk? What's the transaction risk, right? What's the risk of this transaction going through? And historically, the answer would be, okay, well, are they competitors or not? And if they're not, then okay, well, I mean, limited to no transaction risk, unless you maybe need to do some sector-specific stuff. But in principle, like, you can go ahead, right? There is not a condition for closing. You can sign and you can transfer the shares without having to get governmental approvals. Or if it's not a competitor, maybe you need to do a filing because there is some overlap here and there, but a couple of weeks and then you get the clearance. And most transactions risk would be with main competitors, right? That would try to acquire another competitor. And that is, I wouldn't say it's shifted, but it has expanded, right? So those concerns are still there, right? Competition policy is there to stay. But what is now included in this analysis as well is what is the investment screening risk? Or if it's a US-based transaction, what's the CFIUS risk, right? So what is the risk that this purchaser will not be able to get national security clearances? And there you see that if the target company is active in a sensitive industry, essentially you as a lawyer, you need to advise that certain purchasers from certain countries just carry with them more risk. And in that respect, you see that sellers then say, okay, well then never mind, right? Then we'll find a US EU purchaser, or well, we do have this strategic investor from China that's maybe active in the same market. There's not really competition concerns because their market share is quite low, and they do really want to invest in a company and seriously engage with that target company as an investment. But there's this security consideration where certain US EU assets might then be transferred towards China. So the Chinese interested party would have to really make an excellent offer compared to anyone else. And that excellent offer would then, of course, be taken as an indication that they're being state-sponsored or maybe, pursuing other interests and just private risk, because why else are they offering so much more money, right? So you see that this policy has a huge filtering effect, right? The amount of cases that actually wind up that are controversial, that actually wind up on the desks of investment screening authorities have withstood all this legal advice and caution against it. So it has a huge filtering effect. You see the cases that end up in the news, and those are the controversial ones where sometimes the parties to the transactions are okay, it's going to be a tough process, but we'll try, right? They take the risk consciously, but the amount of cases that you don't see are incredible. And this to me is an anecdotal sort of evidence or reason why you see that Chinese investments in the EU and the US have plummeted because of this private sector, legal industry decision-making process that has been so heavily influenced by these new rules.
Thank you, Jochen. Kathleen and then Paul.
Three things I would say here, although I'm not interfacing as readily as Joachim is, but when I talk to the private sector, three common themes. One is about competing standards. And of course, that's nothing new. They're used to competing standards, although, over the last 30 years, we've been making good progress on harmonization and so forth. But in these spaces, we are far from there. And it's worse than that in that, you have retaliatory actions. So if you're trying to comply with a US regulation on this front, and then the Chinese government will come up with a regulation that works exactly counter to that, right? Then how do you comply with both? It's impossible to do so. So the competing and conflicting standards, I think, are posing a number one challenge to private sector companies. Second is the experimentation that is happening and the dynamism that is happening, right? I can only imagine in Joachim's work, right? The guidelines are changing by the day. Information is scant, but what information there is, it's changing readily. So we have a lot of, in the US space, proposed rules that then comments are made, and then we go back and revise the rules. And so not having a consistent frame, and of course, with our election on the horizon, not knowing what will happen thereafter, I think that uncertainty is the second thing. And the third is that because of one effect of this shift to thinking about these security premise tools has been much more attention on particular company action rather than big country action. And so that is our trade regulators are taking an increased interest and expanding their ranks among those staff that are focused on what companies are doing in a way that they hadn't done before. So as companies become increasingly part of the target, they're increasingly policed. You hear companies saying, well, not only now are we targets, but you've also taken away your time from trying to change country activity in our favor. So it's a double whammy. We are targeted in ways we weren't targeted before, and we are taking your attention when you really should be spending your attention on changing other country practices. So that, I think, attention deficit and attention increase is something that I hear on a regular basis from companies.
Thank you, Kathleen. Paul?
I would mention exposure to supply chain risks as issue number one. Here, the EU approach envisages developing new standards for supply chain security. This comes directly from the mission letter of President von der Leyen to Commissioner for Trade and Economic Security. It's interesting that in the new EU term, which is slowly beginning, there will be an economic security commissioner, and that task is actually bundled together with trade policy. So the emphasis after a lot of internal debates seems to be around foreign economic policy above everything else. And here, from the private sector's perspective, standards regarding supply chain security is an area to watch. Another area to watch and to get engaged in is the discussion which is ongoing on screening of outbound investment. Here, the European Commission decided to be more cautious, has not proposed yet concrete measures, but opened the debate through a white paper. So from the private sector perspective, it is essential to look at the measures that have been proposed and take part in the elaboration of the new approach that will be taking place in the next few months. And finally, there are the risk assessments going on in different critical technology fields, which also the private sector involved needs to take to its heart. In the EU's case, the scope is fairly narrow, at least compared to some other countries. So 4 critical technologies are under particular scrutiny. Japan covers 11 critical technologies. Here, there is a lot that will clearly be in the debate, namely how extensive the level of support for companies, for private sector should be in the different reshoring and friendshoring types of activities. For the moment, the EU has no specific budget attached to these activities. Japan has considerable budget in each of the critical technology areas. So from the private sector's perspective, this is another area to clearly get involved in the debate.
Thank you, Paul. So with Joachim and Kathleen and Paul kind of touch upon the overarching reconfiguration in terms of policy that is changing the way private actors are kind of approaching different markets. Joachim kind of touched upon the form of self-regulation through the filtering. And Paul kind of touched upon how the new kind of geostrategic lens and policy position and perception amongst the EU Commission is also going to have implications on the scope by which economic actors could potentially also fall into these policies, and then that could possibly also change their behaviors into what specific sectors they may invest into, as he compared the examples between the EU and Japan. So my overall question to the panelists, what are the implications of all these policies on the governance of the global economic order? As Kathleen is about to leave us at the 45-minute mark, I'll give the floor to her, and then from there we'll go to Paul and Joachim.
Thanks so much, Esther, and I'm sorry to drop off, but the nature of having a class at a particular time, I won't be able to stay. it was a very big question. And in my 1 minute here, let me try and leave some food for thought and look forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. So firstly, I think part of your question was about implications for the global governance system, and I want to also sort of address what does that mean for the transatlantic relationship. So on the implication side, I think it's obvious to say that we've already seen a movement away from having these discussions in our multilateral spaces to having them at the domestic level, to having them in bilateral discussions with trusted partners, and I think that's clear. We don't need to get into that more. But one underestimated area, perhaps one area for potential growth, is I think the space for new types of deals and institutional designs that would address exactly these issues. So one idea that's thrown around, and we're already starting to see sort of manifestations of it, is economic security agreements. Right? What would that look like? That might be an opportunity to harmonize on export controls, harmonize on sanctions, better coordinate on the policy planning of these things, investment screening mechanisms that work in tandem and that follow similar guidelines. Putting that all together in an agreement with a trusted partner would solve some of the problems that we just addressed for the private sector might be facing, and would give them maybe greater certainty, at least in two or more in a plurilateral environment. Is that sort of pie in the sky, as we say? Is that unattainable? Again, I think we're already making some inroads in those spaces in particular sectors, critical technologies, for example. There's no question that the U.S. is speaking closely with trading partners who are like-minded on how to better coordinate some of those policies. And so is that possible for the EU-U.S. relationship? And here I'll end. I think certainly over the years that I've been following it, the EU-U.S. conversation on economic security issues has come closer together. The two parties have come closer together in some of those discussions, but I think they also remain far apart. In diagnosing some of the problems, I think we are very close together, much closer together than we once were. But in actually identifying solutions and being able to do these sorts of new institutional designs to achieve these goals, that's where I think we remain somewhat far apart. And that's not to cast blame at either side. To be sure, the EU is no doubt handicapped by the competence issue. How many of these things that we've just been talking about are regulated at the member state level. And it would be difficult for the Commission to represent those views fully and enter into some of these agreements that would do these things. That's very difficult. But I hope that in the future, that given the commonalities in our views on where the threats are, there will be some low-hanging fruit to enter into some sort of agreements or common designs on addressing those threats. Thanks again, Esther, for the invitation, and wishing you all a wonderful rest of discussion.
Thank you, Kathleen. And now we'll head to Paul and then Jochen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would agree with Kathleen that there is definitely scope for collaboration across the Atlantic on these issues, but there's also a lot of tension in the air with respect to, in particular, how the US goes about approaching China at the moment. With respect to the end destination, there is clearly a preference in Europe for de-risking. And there are actions in the US which points towards more decoupling rather than de-risking. So that's not a subtle difference. It's actually quite a substantive difference, which ideally would need to be clarified at the strategic level. In the meantime, indeed, we need collaboration on especially two aspects. First is identifying the risks. And the second is alignment in how to respond to them. Kathleen was absolutely right that some of these issues are ongoing within the European Union. So with regard to export controls, there is a need for closer collaboration among the 27 member states to start with before we go out and begin collaborating with others. However, I think there is every intention and every will to pursue dialogue with partner countries. And I wouldn't necessarily always call them like-minded, because that may exclude some very valuable partners, especially in the context of supply of critical raw materials. In fact, what I would argue is that we will be witnessing a redefinition of global partnerships around this theme of economic security, because industrialized countries have to realize the extent to which they depend on supply of critical raw materials from partner countries. They have to realize that the new partnership schemes have to be two-way streets, that they cannot simply be contractual. So this will help, in fact, redefining the broader partnership arrangements globally. Where there is stalemate and nothing indicates that that stalemate will be overcome is the global governance level. WTO is pretty much on life support. It's this trade dispute settlement system does not show any promise of becoming workable in the forthcoming period. But who knows? Perhaps after the situation stabilizes in a few years, after the new paradigm is more clearly understood in the different countries, one may think of returning to a sensible debate about how these issues should be addressed at the global governance level, because it's not a mission impossible, and there are a lot of informal discussions, such as on countervailing duties on EVs from China at the moment, which indicate that dialogue is always possible. Now, how to give it an institutional anchoring is, of course, another question. This will take a lot of time.
Jochen?
So I think I've two comments to make, and let me start with the first, let's say, meta comment, which is that we've had a system which was predicated based on free trade, free investments for a long time, and I think agreeing on that on an institutional level is much easier than the system to which we are now shifting, which is one based on security, because security is an interest that is so inherently linked to interests relating to sovereignty, military security, the avoidance of dependencies, and security is, in the institutional sense, is often a type of exception or power. It's very closely related to clear executive power, whether it's with the president's office in the US or with the member states. And even on a member state level, you see that the function of security is exercised very differently, with some member states having this more in an economic, like Ministry of Economic type of environment, and other member states having this power exercised by the Prime Minister's office. So that's from an institutional perspective, and that makes it just very hard to align on this on an international level, and to sort of bring this back to the system that we had, which is now the system that's being shifted away from. So I see a fundamental challenge there on a meta level. And I think the second sort of discourse we've had here was on EU-US relations. And there, I think there is a lot of cooperation between the EU and the US, and rightly so, being close partners, being both together in NATO. And I think that alignment is probably easier on things like sanctions. It probably works on a couple of things like export control. You do see the tensions with ASML, for instance, in the Netherlands, where the Netherlands is put under pressure by the US to impose additional measures, which they have done now. Where interests are partly aligned, and the Dutch government is receptive to the concerns also expressed by the US and agrees with them in part, but also seeks to protect ASML's business in China, which was around 80% in the last year. And there you see also a challenge. I mean, where if we actually look back to the origin of open strategic autonomy or strategic autonomy, it was with Trump, who said he would pull out of NATO, and who said he would not protect the member state of NATO if they wouldn't pay. And that sort of opened up the EU's eyes to the possibility that maybe the US is not always a fully reliable partner. And now we're probably, hopefully, looking at a Harris presidency rather than a Trump presidency. But even if we get Harris now, maybe 4 years down the road, there will be a smarter version of Trump. And what does that mean for the EU's own strategic autonomy when it comes to defense, right? Where US interests are in a way different. They want to maintain power, more like international power, hegemony, however you want to call it, vis-a-vis China, whereas Europe has Russia to deal with as well. And the NATO type of threat there is it's very different. And Europe has to carefully balance its relationship with the US whilst also aiming to protect its own strategic autonomy to allow it to independently protect its own territory.
Thank you, Jochen. Well, that brings me to my last question. As all the panelists kind of touched upon the disparate kind of policy perceptions and objectives among the EU and US side, it brings us to the final question, which is what are the prospects of a common approach to economic security, especially amongst transatlantic partners such as the EU and the US? Do you think it will be much more broad-based or selective, such as sector-specific? I remembered one of the panelists touched upon how there is some consensus among the EU and US on critical minerals, for example. So I open this to the panel. We'll start with Powell and then Jochen.
I think the answer to your question very much depends on the outcome of the US presidential elections, even though there are, of course, things in common between the different approaches in the US. We have also seen President Biden raise tariffs on Chinese goods to a much higher level than President Trump did. So it's not that there isn't a bipartisan consensus in the US, even if the word bipartisan may not be used to describe it very often internally in the US debate. However, the outcome will matter. I think what is important is to build a common understanding of where we are in the global economic system. Namely, what is the nature of the Chinese model, because that is the biggest question conceptually that we are currently facing, and converging on this analysis, I think, would be crucial, the most important step. Collaboration on issues like critical raw materials is essential, and I think this will be much easier. But it will be more difficult to draw conclusions from how we read China's future role in the global economy, because Europe clearly still cherishes some hopes or illusions, depending on your point of view, that China can remain a closely integrated member of the global economic system of exchange. Now, this may not necessarily prove to be the case, given what we are already witnessing with overcapacity that China demonstrates in several key sectors. So arriving at this analytical understanding, I think, would be the crucial starting point. Collaboration on practical measures will be much easier to carry out.
Thank you, Paul. Jochen?
I think Paul really hit the nail on his head. I think it's an excellent summary. I think there are clear, let's say, islands of opportunity to work together on sanctions on critical raw materials, on some of the stuff of critical technologies. You see the Trade and Technology Council working on those areas already. There will be other areas which will be harder to work on, or like harder to align on, like what is economic security, what is the purpose there, how are we going to narrow down this concept in a way that provides more legal certainty, in a way that ensures the rule of law, in a way that it is applied in a objective, predictable, non-discriminatory manner. I think these questions will be, on a meta level, will be hard to answer, because I think the US approach and the EU approach are still quite different. Where the US approach does not like to narrow down national security, I think there is a push in the EU to try to guide this also give the member states guidance on what they can and cannot do, what EU is or is not pursuing. And there I see on a meta level, I see a little bit, I see more challenges to really reach a consensus on what it means. But on specific type of issues that come up, I think there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for those remarks. It's very clear that specificity is the road to possibly further collaboration between the EU and US. And with that we've approached the end of the webinar. Unfortunately, as we run out of time, we have no time for Q&A, but I hope to have a part 2 of this discussion, because it's very clear from our panel's insights that this remains very much evolving on both sides of the Atlantic. I'd like to especially thank our panel, Professor Kathleen Clausen, Mr. Paul Svoboda, and Mr. Joachim de Kock for their insights and expertise into this exciting, but also very sobering, oftentimes discussion on what it means, what economic security will have in terms of the global economic governance and so forth. But I really appreciate your insights, and I hope our audience has enjoyed the discussions. And thank you very much. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well.
Bye.
Bye-bye.